Sir John Sawyers, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Christiane.
So with all the telegraphing, it's obvious that there is going to be some kind of strike, some kind of response, right? It's not if, it's when.
I certainly think there should be a strike. What we've seen is repeated use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime, which is contrary to all the international legal norms, treaties that all the major powers have signed up to. Maintaining the taboo against chemical weapons, that's all rather frayed over the last 5 years or so during the Syrian conflict. We've even seen a chemical agent used on the streets of an English city. And I think it's really important that the Western powers act to re-establish the norm that no one uses chemical weapons.
Do you think that's a case that parliament and people will accept? The French president says they have proof. Now, you just mentioned the Novichok weapons against Skripal here, and the head of GCHQ came out with a very forceful statement about it, and OPCW, the International Anti-Chemical Weapon Group, have said that they verify the UK report on what killed, or rather what poisoned the Skripals. So, to your point, is a case being made that this is now the time to finally draw a red line under the use of chemical weapons?
The red line was drawn in 1925 after the First World War. And our grandfathers and great-grandfathers who died in the First World War, one consolation they might have taken away from the ghastliness of that conflict was that chemical weapons would never be used again. And then in 1997, we all signed up to the Chemical Weapons Convention, which required the dismantling of all chemical weapons stocks. This was a big step forward in humanity. And now what's happened is, because of the conflict in Syria, and we've seen it used in the Iraq-Iran war back in the 1980s as well, people seem to think that using chemical weapons is sort of okay if you can get away with it. So I think it is important that we take action to restore that norm. Now, had we taken action in 2013, then perhaps we wouldn't have needed to take action again in 2018. And it may be we need to do more now than we would have had to do back in 2013. But this is, if we do nothing, we just accept that we don't approve of chemical weapons, we're not going to do anything about it when they're used, then it will become a more normal thing to happen in the world, and we don't want that.
If you were still at MI6, or if you were still the UN ambassador to the UK, do you believe that you'd be able to convince the Prime Minister to take action without going to Parliament?
Well, I'm not involved in that at the moment at this time. When I was Chief MI6, David Cameron was Prime Minister, and we did actually convince him, but he made the mistake of taking this to Parliament. Now, I think...
They made the mistake. That's really interesting.
Well, Parliament's role is to debate and decide on legislation and to hold the government to account. Parliament's not there to take executive decisions on behalf of the government, and this is an executive decision to uphold an international norm. I don't think this is an issue for Parliament. They should debate it after the fact, and they can hold the government to account for the execution.
So a Prime Minister doesn't need permission?
No.
And what about in the US Congress? Because obviously there's some words from some people in Congress that the President should not rely on what they're now calling outdated and expired resolutions and authorizations, that he too should go to Congress.
We are here. We're not going to war in Syria. We're not trying to alter the outcome of the Syrian civil war. We had a chance to do that back in 2012, actually, when we could have established safe zones in Syria. We could have involved Western forces against the Assad regime. We opted not to do that. We then decided not even to uphold the red line on chemical weapons. That created a space for the Russians and the Iranians to settle Syria's civil war on their terms. And that's basically resolved now. We've had the success, and this is an area where the Obama and Trump administrations have given a good lead, is the destruction of Islamic State, ISIS, on the ground in Syria and Iraq. That's an important step forward. But the reality is the Syrian regime have prevailed in this conflict. This issue now is not about the Syrian civil war. This issue is about use of chemical weapons, and we need to focus on that. We need to be clear in the public justification of action that this is what it's about, and any future use of chemical weapons will face a similar response.
So what is the strategy? And at the same time, how do you convince the Russians that this is a strategy that they too need to be involved in?
Well, I think the Russian dimension, I think, is quite important, because there have been a series of Russian actions against which the West has pushed back. We talked about the Skripal case, and I think the Russians were surprised that it wasn't just Britain that responded, but there were, I think, 26 countries, as well as the NATO headquarters, that expelled Russian intelligence officers. And the United States has taken action in response to Russian meddling in the US elections with a whole series of sanctions against oligarchs and Russian companies. And we're now seeing this action in Syria. Now, this isn't part of a concerted plot against Russia, but the Russians might see it that way. So one thing which is really important here is clarity of communication to the Russians about what this is about. We had that during the Cold War. It's decayed a bit, frankly, over the last 20 years. I think the crisis in Ukraine in 2014 was in part a consequence of poor quality communications between, above all, Washington and Moscow, and between the West and Moscow generally.
But what about the fear that Russia has basically vetoed what the US and its allies want to do just in the last few days regarding Syria? What about the fear that they also could be targeted? I mean, we see the map. Russian bases, or Syrian bases, or Iranian bases, it's all interlinked.
Yeah, well, they are. I think when the Trump administration took some action a year ago, it was fairly modest action, they notified the Russians in advance that there was going to be strikes and the Russians should keep out of the way. I think Russians and Americans have gone to great lengths to avoid a direct confrontation. There was actually one 2 months ago near the city of Deir ez-Zor, where Russian mercenaries in the so-called Wagner battalion were attacked by US forces. And I don't think either side realized how many Russians were involved and how many Russians might have been killed in that. Neither side wants a repeat of that. But equally, making a few holes in a runway is not going to be enough to deter the Syrians from doing this again. It didn't have that impact last time because the Syrians have used chemical weapons once more. So it's going to have to be a notch up from that.
So what is a notch up?
Well, I think they're probably going to have to target some regime installations.
Such as?
I'm not going to speculate on that. I think the trouble with this delay is that the Syrians, like the Iraqis before them, in the Saddam era, that when there's a likelihood of military strikes, they will jam the likely targets full of women and children and then make it look like a Western massacre. Now, the likely source of the likely targets being identified by the Pentagon and the British Ministry of Defence and their French counterparts, they will be being scrutinised very carefully against those sorts of practices. And I think it is a problem about this sort of delay. You need to pull together the evidence. You need to be confident that this is a Syrian regime use of chemical weapons. I think our leaders now have that confidence.
Yes, has said that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Mrs. May and President Trump will also be coming to that conclusion. But if you allow it to be strung out for too long, and that will be what the Russians and the Syrians are trying to do, then the military response loses its impact.
So from your knowledge of the relationship between Russia, the US, etc., what do you think is going to be the end result of any action that is taken right now? I mean, there are many critics who say that just a bunch of feel-good military strikes is simply going to continue emboldening Assad, that he's seen the West's response before and he's basically laughing at it.
Well, that's why you need to take steps which are sufficient to cause him some pain. As I say, we're not trying to affect at this stage the outcome of the Syrian civil war. Too late for that, basically. But he didn't need to use these chemical weapons. He was actually, as I understand it, involved in a negotiation with the opposition groups in Duma, which ran into some difficulty. And in order to finally tip the balance in his direction, he used these chemical weapons completely unnecessarily. It was a reckless use of any sort of weaponry at that stage, above all chemical weapons, and against civilian targets as well as the opposition fighters. You just can't allow that to go unanswered. Now, obviously, you don't want to escalate this so it becomes a conflict between the United States and Russia. Russia, of course, will stand by their ally. They will condemn Western military action, and they will try to confuse the picture as much as possible. That's standard Russian modus operandi. But the West has certain values in this. We need to stick together. The important thing with an assertive Russia is that we stand up to it. We have the capability to defend ourselves, both on the ground militarily and in the cyber realm as well, so that we can deal with Russian cyber attacks. But we also need very clear communications with the Russians, which I think we can improve on.
Really interesting. So, John Sawyers, thank you very much indeed.
Christiane, thank you.